thus stands out as one of the most evil persons in recent history. We must now explain whence this evil comes and how it is possible that such a person could enjoy a public reputation as a scientist. The reasons for this have to do with a cancer growing on world history, the cancer of oligarchism. Between the year 1200 AD and about 1600 AD, the world center of gravity for the forces of oligarchism was the oligarchy of Venice. Towards the end of that time, the Venetian oligarchy decided, for various reasons, to transfer its families, fortunes, and characteristic outlook to a new base of operations, which turned out to be the British Isles. The old program of a worldwide Roman Empire with its capital in Venice was replaced by the new program of a worldwide Roman Empire with its capital in London, what eventually came to be known as the British Empire. This was the metastasis of the cancer, the shift of the Venetian party from the Adriatic to the banks of the Thames. And this has been the main project of the world oligarchy in the past 5 centuries. The Venetian party, wherever it is, believes in epistemological warfare. The Venetian party knows that ideas are more powerful weapons than guns, fleets, and bombs. In order to secure acceptance for their imperial ideas, the Venetian party seeks to control the way people think. If you can control the way that people think, say the Venetians, you can control their reactions to events, no matter what those events might be. It is therefore vital to the Venetians to control philosophy and especially science, the area where human powers of hypothesis and creative reason become a force for improvements in the order of nature. The Venetian party is implacably hostile to scientific discovery. Since the days of Aristotle, they have attempted to suffocate scientific discovery by using formalism and the fetishism of authoritative professional opinion. The Venetian party also has over the years created a series of scientific frauds and hoaxes, bogus shams, which have been elevated to the status of incontrovertible and unchallengeable authorities. These have been used to usurp the rightful honor due to real scientists, whom the Venetians have done everything possible to destroy. We can identify the Venetian faction which has been responsible for the most important of these scientific and epistemological frauds. They can be called the Dead Souls faction. We could also call them the No-Soul Brothers of Venetian intelligence. This is because their factional pedigree is based on the belief that human beings have no soul. Their factional creed is the idea that human beings have no creative mental powers and are therefore incapable of forming hypotheses and cannot make scientific discoveries. Now, we can approach these Venetian dead souls in 3 groups. There is first the group around Pietro Pomponazzi, Gasparo Contarini, and Francesco Giorgi, the first group you see who were active in the first part of the 1500s. Secondly, there is the group of Paolo Sarpi and his right-hand man, Fulgencio Micanzio, who were the case officers for Galileo Galilei. This was the group that opposed Kepler in the early 1600s. Thirdly, we have the group around Abbot Antonio Conti and Gianmaria Ortez in the early 1700s. This was the group that created the Newton myth and modern materialism, or utilitarianism. And this was the group that combated Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. These 3 groups of Venetian game masters are responsible for a great deal of the obscurantism and garbage that weighs like a nightmare on the brain of humanity today. They are the founders of modern atheism, modern materialism, and are considered by communists to be the predecessors of dialectical materialism. Now, the leading figure in the first group in the early 1500s was Gasparo Contarini. In other locations, we have told the story of how Contarini, for reasons of Venetian raison d'etat, set into motion the Protestant Reformation, including Martin Luther, King Henry VIII of England, Calvin of Geneva, and the Italian crypto-Protestants known as gli spirituali. At the same time, Contarini was a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church who masterminded the early phases of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Contarini was in particular the personal protector of Ignatius of Loyola and played a decisive role in establishing the Jesuit order. Contarini also convoked the Council of Trent on an Aristotelian platform. Now it is with Contarini's teacher, Pomponazzi, that we see the explicit factional pedigree of the Dead Souls faction. Pomponazzi started from Aristotle, as the Venetian party always does. Aristotle said that there is no thought which is not mixed with sense impressions, phantasma. This meant that there is no part of our mental life which is not somehow contaminated by matter. For Pomponazzi, this proved that the soul does not exist, since it has no immaterial substance. Contarini warned Pomponazzi not to take this matter any further, but he also remarked that the only time the existence of the soul is really certain is when the person is already dead. For Contarini, as a practical matter, there is no empirical human soul that you can be aware of while you're still alive. Now, Francesco Zorzi was the envoy of this group to Henry VIII, to whom he became the resident sex advisor. Zorzi illustrates the typical profile of a Venetian intelligence operative in the early 1500s. He was a Franciscan friar, but his main occupation was black magic of the Rosicrucian variety. He was a conjurer, a necromancer, an apparitionist. If you think of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus conjuring up the devil, you have the portrait of Zorzi. Now, this is not a good model for the science nerds of any age. As the 1500s turns into the 1600s, this profile began to present serious drawbacks and limitations. Until about 1600, the posture of the Venetian party towards science was one of more or less open hostility, favoring black magic. But in the early 1600s, the group around Sarpi succeeded in changing their public profile from being the enemies of science to being the embodiment of the most advanced and sophisticated science. For several centuries after this, the Venetians would work inside the scientific community to take it over. They would claim to represent the highest expression of scientific values. In this way, they could institutionalize the dead hand of formalism, the fetishism of authority, and irrationalism, so as to stifle the process of discovery. The chief of Venetian intelligence in this period, who made this possible, was Paolo Sarpi. Sarpi and his friend Fulgencio Micanzio were Servite monks. Sarpi was part of an important Venetian salon of the day, the Ridotto Morosini, which met for discussions in the palace of the Morosini family on the Grand Canal. The Morosini were the direct ideological heirs of Contarini. The Morosini salon centered on a discussion of science, and it became a nucleus for the youthful faction of the Venetian oligarchy, the so-called Giovani, who became powerful especially after 1582. The Giovani favored a policy of cooperation with Holland, England, and France in conflicts against the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs and against the papacy. There was another faction called I Vecchi, the Oldies, which serviced the Venetian network on the Spanish and papal side, and these, of course, were quite extensive. Now, we have told in other locations how Sarpi organized and unleashed the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, using agents like Max von Thurn und Taxis, Christian von Anhalt, Christoph von Dohna, the Elector Palatine Frederick, the so-called Winter King. In this sense, Paolo Sarpi personally exterminated about 1/3 of the entire population of Europe and about 1/2 of the population of Germany and surrounding areas. Sarpi also caused the assassination of King Henry IV of France, when Henry opposed Sarpi's designs and exposed him as an atheist. Paolo Sarpi, as we can see, is a worthy predecessor for Bertrand Russell. Now, Sarpi in his own time was most proud of his reputation as a mathematician. One contemporary wrote of him, "I can say about him without any exaggeration whatsoever that no one in Europe excels him in his knowledge of the mathematical sciences." Who thought that? That is the view of Sarpi held by Galileo Galilei. Sarpi had companions in the Ridotto Morosini during the 1590s. There was the influential mystic Giordano Bruno. Starting in 1592, there was also a professor of mathematics who taught at the nearby University of Padova between 1592 and 1610. This was Galileo Galilei, originally a Florentine. Galileo was a paid agent of Sarpi and of Sarpi's right-hand man, Micanzio. There is a correspondence on scientific subjects between Sarpi and Galileo. It centers on magnetism, because this was Sarpi's favorite science, because he thought it looked most occult. Galileo proposed some of his first ideas on falling bodies to Sarpi, who enthused that Galileo had been born to solve the question of motion. Now, Galileo's fame was procured when he used a small telescope to observe the moons of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn, the phases of Venus, and so forth. Galileo reported these sightings in his essay, The Starry Messenger, which instantly made him the premier scientist in Europe, and thus a very important agent of influence for the Venetian party. Now, the entire telescope operation had been devised and carried out by Paolo Sarpi. The first telescope had been built by Leonardo da Vinci about 100 years before Galileo. Susan Welsh has called attention to the research of Domenico Argentieri on Leonardo's optical manuscripts. And these demonstrate that Leonardo had a telescope with a convex lens at one end and a concave lens at the other end. Its magnifying power was rather weak, but it was a telescope. There are then reports of telescopes being made in Italy in the late 1500s, and by 1608 there were many telescopes turning up in Holland. Galileo says that he was encouraged by reports of these telescopes to build his own telescope in 1609, says Galileo. Sarpi's version of these events is more revealing. He wrote in March of 1610 that a telescope had been found in Holland 2 years before, therefore in the spring of 1608. Sarpi wrote, "Once this was found, our mathematician here in Padua and some of our other people who are not ignorant of these arts began to use the telescope on celestial bodies, adjusting it and refining it for that purpose." Notice, Galileo and some of our other people. It would also appear that the observations were made not from Padua, but from Paolo Sarpi's Servite monastery in Venice. Sarpi wrote about Galileo as our mathematician, saying that he had frequently discussed these questions with Galileo and didn't need to read what Galileo wrote about them later. In 1611, there was a Polish visitor to Venice by the name of Rey, who wrote that Galileo had not been the inventor of the telescope, but that the advisor, author, and director of the telescope project had been Father Paolo Sarpi, who is considered the greatest mathematician here. Now, in 1597, Johannes Kepler had sent a copy of his new book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, to Galileo. This was the work in which Kepler proposed the Platonic solids as a basis for the understanding of the harmonic ordering of the planetary orbits around the sun. Galileo thereupon sent a letter to Kepler claiming that he too was a follower of the Copernican or heliocentric view, but that he had not dared to come forward with this view because of fear, and he preferred to sit on the whole business because of the climate of opinion. Kepler had written back urging Galileo to be confident and go forward with the struggle for truth. He offered to find publishers in Germany if the Italian climate were too oppressive. Galileo did not do this, and he refused to comment in detail on Kepler's book. According to Kepler's biographer Caspar, in the following years, Galileo plagiarized Kepler by using material from Kepler in his lectures without giving Kepler any credit. Now, Kepler and Galileo were in frequent contact for over 30 years. Kepler commented with benevolent interest but with subtle polemics about Galileo's published work. Galileo never systematically commented on Kepler's laws. In 1609, Kepler published his Astronomia Nova, expounding the first and second laws of planetary motion, that the planets move in ellipses of which the sun is one focus, and that the planets sweep out equal areas in equal times between themselves and the sun as they revolve. In Galileo's dialogues on the two great world systems, published in 1633, therefore much later, Kepler is hardly mentioned, while the discussion centers on Copernicus, with his perfect circle orbits of the planets around the sun, which of course had no hope of accounting for the observed position of the planets. And at the end of this dialogue, one of Galileo's characters says that he's surprised that Kepler is so puerile as to attribute the ideas of tides, to the attractions of the moon. Now, during the first years of the pontificate of Pope Urban VIII Barberini, Galileo was the semi-official scientist for the Pope. But in 1631 there was a political change when the Swedish Protestant army of Gustavus Adolphus fought its way through Germany, reached the Alps, and seemed ready to sweep down on Rome. Urban VIII turned abruptly from a pro-French policy to a pro-Spanish policy. The Spanish ascendancy is the backdrop for the trial of Galileo, carried out by the Dominicans with Jesuit support. Some years earlier, Sarpi had forecast these events, saying that if Galileo insisted on leaving Venice to go to Rome, the Jesuits and others were likely to turn the question of physics and astronomy into a theological question, so as to condemn Galileo as an excommunicated heretic and force him to recant all his views on this subject. Sarpi in 1616 seemed to have a pretty good idea of what was going to happen 15 years later, well after his own death. And of course, for Galileo, this trial was one of the greatest public relations successes of all time. This was Sarpi's plan. Now, Sarpi's philosophical and scientific writings were not published until after World War II. These are the Pensieri, or Thoughts, and the Arte di ben pensare, the art of thinking well. Sarpi's achievement for Venetian intelligence was to abstract the method of Aristotle from the mass of opinions expressed by Aristotle on this or that particular issue. In this way, sense certainty could be kept as the basis of scientific experiments, and Aristotle's embarrassing, outdated views on certain natural phenomena could be jettisoned. This allowed the Venetians to preserve the essential Aristotle, even as they attacked the Aristotelian or peripatetic school, say, the Jesuits of the Collegio Romano in Rome, where the education was to read Aristotle and comment on it. These writings by Sarpi have not been translated, but if you want to become familiar with them, you can read Sir Francis Bacon. The Bacon-Hobbes ménage was in close touch with Sarpi and Micancio. Another way to read about Sarpi is to read Locke. The problem is that Locke takes about 1,000 pages to write what Sarpi put down in about 30. Okay. In this art of thinking well, Sarpi starts, of course, from sense perception and sense certainty. He says that the impression made on our sensory apparatus by outside objects has got to be distinguished from those outside objects. And he points especially to tastes, odors, sounds, which he thinks are a matter of our nervous system, not existing in outside reality. There's a different category of ideas of quantity, size, and time. These are thought to be objective. In the same manuscript, Sarpi lists the immortality of the soul as one on a list of wrong ideas. Sarpi repeats the argument of Pomponazzi, that since there is no knowledge without sensations, the soul dies with the body. So again we have the trademark of the Venetian dead souls faction. Now, Galileo's epistemology comes straight from Sarpi. We can see this best in Galileo's 1623 essay, Il Saggiatore, the assayer, as it's translated. For Galileo, colors, tastes, sounds, and smells are mere words. They exist only for our bodies. And here Galileo makes the famous comparison of these to tickling. If you brush a feather over the soles of the feet or the armpits of a marble statue, you will not produce a tickle. But if you do this to a human being, you will cause that tickling sensation. So Galileo says that that is what these sense impressions do to us. They create something that's not out there, but it's in us, the tickle. Hoochie. So Galileo says, it's time to get rid of ears, tongues, and noses, odors, shapes, and sounds, and go for shapes, numbers, and motions. Objective, mathematical. And from this he proceeds quickly to a very reductionist theory of atoms, in which he explains that heat is the effect of fiery minims, or igneous atoms. The important thing is that Galileo's epistemology is identical with that of Sarpi. It is taken from Sarpi. And this is what Galileo means when he says, put aside Aristotle and read the truth in the book of nature, where it's written in mathematical characters. Now, Sarpi died in 1623. At that point, Galileo's case officer became the Servite monk Fulgencio Micanzio. After Galileo had been condemned by the Inquisition, Micanzio reminded Galileo of the assignment that he had received from Sarpi 20 years earlier, to write a treatise on motion. And, by the way, added Micanzio, I have 258 pounds here for you. You can see this in the letters. Later, Micanzio would procure Galileo a state pension of 60 scudi per year from the coffers of the serene, most serene Venetian Republic, who don't give away money very easily. Galileo responded to Micanzio's orders with the 1638 Discourses on two new sciences, mechanics and motion. Now, how could Galileo be published? He'd been condemned by the Inquisition. He could not be published anywhere where the papal authority was strong. So Micanzio arranged for Galileo's books to be printed by the Dutch Elsevier Press in Leiden, Holland. In 1634, Micanzio wrote to Galileo that he had been talking to an expert in science and philosophy. These were called virtuosi, virtuosos in the parlance of the day. And the virtuoso had said, well, Galileo has a lot of ability, but everything that he writes about is not new. It's already in Kepler. Indeed, Galileo wrote back that the correct answer to this is that although Galileo and Kepler may sometimes seem to agree about certain astronomical phenomena, my way of philosophizing, says Galileo, is so different from his. Now, in letters written in 1640, Galileo threw further light on his own scientific method. This was after he was condemned, but I think this is still sincere. Galileo complained that he had been misunderstood. Against all the reason in the world, I am accused of impugning peripatetic doctrine, Aristotelian philosophy, whereas I profess and am certain of observing more religiously the peripatetic, or to put it better, Aristotelian teachings than many others. Galileo then asserted that he had tried to study phenomena that in all natural effects assure me of their existence, their ansit. Do they exist? Are they there? Whereas I gain nothing from knowing how, quo modo. So the big question is, does it exist? Not how does it exist? And what Galileo is trying to express here, I think, is the same thing that Newton meant with his infamous hypotheses non fingo. I do not fabricate hypotheses. Which brings us to Newton. The next phase of the corruption of science by Venice depends on a rather obscure Cambridge don by the name of Isaac Newton. For the oligarchy, Newton and Galileo are the only two contenders for the honor of being the most influential thinker for their faction since Aristotle himself. These are the two. The British oligarchy praises Newton as the founder of modern science. But at the same time, they have been unable to keep secret the fact that Newton was a raving irrationalist, a cultist kook. Among the oligarchs, it was the British economist Lord John Maynard Keynes, a fellow Cambridge graduate, who first began to open the black box of Newton's real character. Was Newton the first and greatest of the modern scientists, the practitioner of cold and untinctured reason? No, said Keynes. Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last wonderful child to whom the Magi could do sincere homage. Keynes based his views on the contents of a box. What box? And what was in the box? The box contained papers which Newton had packed up when he left Cambridge for London in 1696, ending his Cambridge career and beginning his new life in London as a member and president of the Royal Society, director of the Mint, and the resident magus of the new British Empire. Now, inside the box were manuscripts and papers totaling some 1.2 million words. That's about as long as Shakespeare's complete works, if you're counting. After Newton's death, Bishop Horsley was asked to inspect the box with a view to publication, but when he saw the contents, he recoiled in horror and slammed the lid. No one opened the box for another 100 years. After a century had passed, Newton's 19th century biographer, Sir David Brewster, looked into the box. He decided to save Newton's reputation by fishing out a few selections, but he falsified the rest with straight fibbing, as Keynes says. Now, the box became known as the Portsmouth Papers. A few mathematical papers were given to Cambridge University in 1888. In 1936, the then owner, Lord Lymington, needed money, so the papers were auctioned off. Now, Keynes was alarmed. He bought as many as he could, but the papers were scattered from Jerusalem to America. As Keynes points out, Newton was a suspicious, paranoid, unstable personality. In 1692, Newton had had a nervous breakdown and never regained his former consistency of mind. Newton's friends, Pepys and Locke, thought that he had become deranged. And Keynes writes that Newton emerged from his breakdown slightly gaga. And of course, as Keynes stresses, Newton was wholly aloof from women. Although he had some close young male friends, Newton once angrily attacked John Locke, accusing him of trying to embroil him with women. But nevertheless, in the last decades, the lid of the box has been partially, and I think grudgingly, opened by the Anglophile scholars who were the keepers of the Newton myth. Now, what can we see inside the box? First, Newton was a supporter of the Arian heresy. He denied and attacked the Holy Trinity. Therefore, he denied the filioque, the concept of imago viva Dei. Keynes thought that Newton was a Judaic monotheist of the school of Maimonides, which I guess suggests that he was a Kabbalist. For Newton, to worship Christ as God was idolatry and a mortal sin. Now, even in the Church of England, you had to keep these views secret or face ostracism. Now, Newton's real interest was not mathematics or astronomy, neither one. It was alchemy. His laboratory at Trinity College, Cambridge, was fitted out for alchemy. Here his friends said, the fires never went out during 6 weeks of the spring and 6 weeks of the autumn. Now, what is alchemy? The kind of symbolism you see here. What kind of research was Newton doing? His sources were books like Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum of Elias Ashmole, the Rosicrucian leader of British speculative Freemasonry. Newton owned all 6 heavy quarto volumes of Ashmole. Now, the goal of the alchemists was the quest for the mythical philosopher's stone, which would permit the alchemist to transmute lead and other base metals into gold. The alchemists also hoped that the philosopher's stone would give them other magical powers, such as rejuvenation and eternal youth. That is Newton's picture of the philosopher's stone as he imagined it. Now, alchemy also involved the relations between the astrological influences of the planets and the behavior of the chemicals. One book that dealt with this was called The Metamorphosis of the Planets. Since the planet Jupiter had precedence among the planets, it also occupied a privileged position among the reagents of alchemy. Newton expressed this idea with a picture which he personally drew of Jupiter enthroned on the obverse of the title page of this book. Now, what were Newton's findings? Let's let him speak for himself. And I quote, "Concerning magnesia of the green lion, it is called Prometheus and the chameleon, also androgyne and verdant earth, in which the sun has never cast its rays, although he is the father of the moon and its mother. Also common mercury, dew of heaven, which makes the earth fertile, nitre of the wise, instructio de arbore solari. It is the Saturnine stone." Now that seems to have been written in the 1670s. In the 1690s, Newton added, "Now this green earth is the green ladies of B. Valentine, the beautiful green Venus, and the green venereal element, emerald, and green earth of Snyder's, with which he fed his lunary Mercury, and by virtue of which Diana was to bring forth children, and out of which, saith Ripley, the blood of the green lion is drawn in the beginning of the work." Well, during the 1680s, Newton, in the middle of this, he composed a series of aphorisms of alchemy, the 6th of which goes as follows. "The young newborn king is nourished in a bigger heat with milk drawn by distillation from the putrefied matter of the second work. With this milk he must be imbibed 7 times to putrefy him sufficiently, and then decocted to the white and red, and in passing to the red he must be imbibed with a little red oil to fortify the solidary nature and make the red stone more flexible." And so it goes for more than 1,000,000 words. Written during the period of 20 years when he was supposedly writing Principia Mathematica. We have green lions. Green lions are the big ones, but androgyne, male and female principles, Pan, Osiris, and so on. It has been truly said that Milton probed the literature of alchemy as it had never been probed before or since, all the time supposedly writing his Principia. In addition, he had time to do the plan for King Solomon's temple and a chronology of biblical events which cut history by several hundred years. They were taken out and jettisoned. Now, what about Newton's supposed discoveries? Upon closer scrutiny, it turns out that he had no discoveries. We take the example of his alleged law of universal attraction, which states that the force of attraction between 2 point masses is equal to the product of the 2 masses divided by the square of the distance between them, times a constant. This is Newton's so-called inverse square law. Now, it has long been known that this was not really a new discovery, but rather derived from some tinkering from Kepler's third law. Kepler had established that the cube of a planet's distance from the sun divided by the square of its year always equaled a constant. By supplementing this with Huygens' formula for centrifugal acceleration and making some substitutions, it is possible to obtain the inverse square relationship. This issue is settled in the appendices to the Science of Christian Economics. But the partisans of Newton still claim that Newton explained gravity. By opening the lid of the box, we find that Newton himself confesses in an unpublished note that his great achievement indeed was cribbed from Kepler. Newton wrote, I began to think of gravity extending to the orb of the moon, and having found how to estimate the force with which a globe revolving presses the surface of a sphere, from Kepler's rule in the periodic times of the planets being in sesqui-alternate proportion to their distances from the center of their orbs, I deduced that the forces which keep the planets in their orbs must be reciprocally as the squares of their distances from the centers about which they revolve. In other words, Newton arrived at the inverse square relation by substituting Kepler's third law into Huygens' recently published formula for centrifugal force. And others, Hooke, Christopher Wren, others claim to have done the same thing at the same time. Now, Newton's love of alchemy and magic surfaces as the basis of his entire outlook, including in the supposed scientific writings. In his Optics, he talks about small particles which have certain powers, virtues, or forces by which they can act at a distance. Act at a distance. How, I do not consider, but what I call attraction can be performed by some impulse or other means unknown to me. This is Newton's notion of gravity as action as a distance, which Leibniz rightly mocked as black magic. Newton also wrote about an electric spirit, or a mysterious medium which he called the ether. What the basis of these is in alchemy is not clear. And then there's the story of Newton's invention of the calculus. In reality, Newton in his entire life never described a calculus. He never had one. What he cooked up was a theory of so-called fluxions and infinite series. This was not a calculus and quickly sank into oblivion when it was published 9 years after Newton's death. By 1710, European scientists had been working with Leibniz's calculus for several decades. It was about that time that Newton and the British Royal Society decided to launch their campaign, claiming that Newton had actually invented the calculus in 1671, although for some strange reason he had never said anything about it in public print during a period of more than 30 years. This was supplemented by a second allegation, which was that Leibniz was a plagiarist who had copied his calculus from Newton after some conversations and letters exchanged during the 1670s. These slanders against Leibniz were written up by Newton and put forward in 1715 as the official verdict of the British Royal Society. And that line was also churned out by scurrilous hack writers directed by Newton. But scientists in continental Europe, and especially the decisive French Academy of Sciences, were not at all convinced by Newton's case. At this point, Newton's reputation on the continent of Europe was at best modest and certainly not exalted. There was even resistance against Newton in England, with a hard core of 20 to 25% of anti-Newton feeling within the Royal Society itself. How then did the current myth of Newton as a scientist originate? The apotheosis of Newton was arranged by Antonio Conti of Venice, the center of our third grouping of the Dead Souls faction. In order to create the myth of Newton as the great modern scientist, Conti was obliged to do what might well have been considered impossible at the time, to create a pro-British party in France. Conti succeeded, and Conti stands as the founder of the Enlightenment that Conor Cruise O'Brien likes so much. The Enlightenment is otherwise understood as the network of the French Anglophiles. Any Frenchman who was degraded enough to become an Anglophile would also be degraded enough to become a Newtonian, and vice versa. The British had no network in Paris that could make this happen, but the Venetians did, thanks most recently to the work of such figures as Montaigne and Pierre Bayle. What the British never could have done, the Venetians accomplished for the greater glory of the Anglo-Venetian party. Now, Antonio Conti was born in Padova in 1677. He was a patrician. He was a member of the Venetian nobility. He was also a defrocked priest who had joined the Oratorian order, but then left it to pursue literary and scientific interests, including Galileo and Descartes. Now, Conti was an abbé. He had minor religious orders, but of course, that didn't mean a whole lot, because Casanova was also an abbé. In 1713, Conti arrived in Paris. This was at the time of the Peace of Utrecht, the end of the very long and bitter War of the Spanish Succession, in which the British, the Dutch, and their allies had invaded and defeated and weakened the France of Colbert and Louis XIV. Louis XIV was about to die, and after which the throne would go to a regent of the House of Orléans. Now in Paris, Conti built up a network centering on the philosopher Malebranche. He also worked with a man called Fontenelle, who was the permanent secretary of the French Academy of Sciences. That was still the premier research center in Europe. Now Conti saw immediately that Fontenelle was a follower of Giordano Bruno, of Ridotto Morosini. So they worked together. Conti became a celebrity in Paris, but he soon announced that he was growing tired of Descartes, the then dominant figure on the French intellectual scene. Conti began telling the Paris Salon that he was turning more and more to Newton and to Leibniz. He began to call attention to the fact that there was this polemic between Newton and Leibniz. What a shame that these two eminent scientists were fighting each other. Perhaps the two outlooks could be reconciled. This would require a tactful mediator, an experienced man of the world. Since the English and the German scientists were at war, who better than an Italian, a Venetian, to come forward as the mediator? Perhaps such a subtle Venetian could also find a way to settle this nasty dispute about the calculus and propose a compromise platform for physics. Now, a solar eclipse was in the offing, and Conti organized a group of French astronomers to go to London and observe it. Probably the London fog would help to see the eclipse. With Conti's help, these Frenchmen would be made into members of the Royal Society, and when they got back to France, they would become the first French Anglophiles of the 18th century French Enlightenment. Now, before he left for London, Conti, with classical Venetian duplicity, wrote a very friendly letter to Leibniz, introducing himself as a supporter of Leibniz's philosophy. Conti claimed that he was going to London to support Leibniz, and he would defend the Leibniz cause in London just as he had done in Paris. Now, by 1715, of course, Leibniz's political perspectives were very grim, since his patroness, Sophie of Hanover, had died in May of the previous year. Leibniz was not going to become Prime Minister of England because the new British king was Georg Ludwig of Hanover, King George I. When Conti got to London, he began to act as a diabolical agent provocateur. He turned on his magnetism, and he charmed Newton. Newton was impressed by his guest and began to let his hair down. Conti told Newton that he had been trained as a Cartesian. "I was myself, when young, a Cartesian," said the sage wistfully, and then added that Cartesian philosophy was nothing but a tissue of hypothesis. And of course Newton didn't like hypothesis. Newton confessed that when he read his first science book, it was an astronomy book, but he couldn't understand it. He read a trigonometry book, couldn't understand that, picked up Descartes and understood it very well. Now, with the ground thus prepared, Conti was soon a regular dinner guest at Newton's house, apparently 3 times a week on average. Conti also had extensive contacts with Edmund Halley and with Newton's local parish priest, an anti-Trinitarian called Samuel Clarke, and with other self-styled scientists. Conti also became friendly with Princess Caroline, the Princess of Wales, who had been an ally of Leibniz. Conti became very popular at the British court, and by November 1715 he was inducted by Newton as a member of the Royal Society. Now, Conti saw that Newton, as a kook, represented the ideal cult figure for a new obscurantist concoction of deductive, inductive, pseudo-mathematical formalism masquerading as science. Thanks to the Venetians, Italy had Galileo, France had Descartes, Now, Conti might have considered concocting a pseudo-scientific ideology for the British based openly on Descartes, but that clearly would not do, since Venice desired to use England above all as a tool to tear down France with endless wars. Venice needed an English Galileo, and Conti provided the intrigue and the public relations necessary to produce one, in a way not so different from Paolo Sarpi 1 century before. Conti received a letter from Leibniz repeating that Newton had never mastered the calculus and attacking Newton for his occult notion of gravitation, his insistence on atoms and the void, and his inductive method. Whenever Conti got a letter from Leibniz, he would show it to Newton to stoke the fires of Newton's obsessive rage to destroy Leibniz. During this same time, Newton's friend Samuel Clarke began an exchange of letters with Leibniz about these and related issues. Now, Voltaire later said about Clarke that he would have been an ideal Archbishop of Canterbury if only he had been a Christian. Leibniz lamented accurately that natural religion itself was decaying in England, where many believe that human souls are material and others view God as a corporeal being. Newton had said that space is an organ which God uses to perceive things. Newton and his followers also had a very odd opinion concerning the work of God. According to their doctrine, God has to wind his watch from time to time, because otherwise the universe would cease to move, and he had not had sufficient foresight to make a perpetual motion universe. All of this gave rise to the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence, and the prime mover behind this was Conti. Now, by now, Conti, as a Venetian chameleon, was a total partisan of Newton's line of atoms and the void, in other words, Newtonian absolute space. If there were no void, wrote Conti, all bodies would be equally heavy, and the comets could not pass through heavenly spaces. Monsieur Leibniz has written his speech to Princess Caroline, but he presents the world not as it is, but as it could be. Now, Newton tried to get the ambassadors of the London Diplomatic Corps to review his old manuscripts and letters. He hoped that they would endorse his findings, and the Royal Society's findings, that Leibniz had plagiarized his calculus. Leibniz had pointed out that the Royal Society had stacked the evidence. Conti used this matter to turn King George I more and more against Leibniz. Conti organized the Baron von Kielmansegge, the Hanoverian minister and husband of King George I's mistress, to issue the opinion that this review of documents would not be enough. The only way to decide the Leibniz-Newton controversy was through a direct exchange of letters between Leibniz and Newton. King George agreed with this. Conti encouraged Newton to make a full reply to Leibniz so that both of the letters could be shown to the king. And when the king heard Newton's version, he indicated that Newton's facts would be very difficult for Leibniz to answer. Conti tried to convince Newton that he should accept the 1715 verdict of the Royal Society, which had given complete credit for the calculus to Newton. In return, Conti generously conceded that Leibniz's calculus was easier to use and more widely accepted. By now, Leibniz was well aware that he was dealing with an enemy operative, but Leibniz died on the 4th of November, 1716, just a few days before Conti arrived in Hanover to meet him. Newton apparently received word of the death of his great antagonist through a letter from Conti. Now, thanks to Conti's intervention as agent provocateur, Newton had received immense publicity. He had become a kind of succès de scandale. The direct exchange mandated by George I had suggested to some that Leibniz and Newton were on the same plane. There was an equivalence. But now Conti's most important work was just beginning. Leibniz was still held in very high regard in all of continental Europe. And of course, here the influence of France was immense. Conti and the Venetians wished to destroy both France and Leibniz. In the Leibniz-Newton contest, Conti had observed that while the English sided with Newton and the Germans with Leibniz, the French, the Italians, the Dutch, and the other continentals would be the decisive swing factor. And they still had great sympathy for Leibniz. And of course, the attitude which prevailed in France, the greatest European power, and culturally the most important in the 18th century, would be decisive. Conti now sought to deliver France plus Italy into the Newtonian camp. Now, Conti had been in London between 1715 and 1718. His mission to France lasted from 1718 through 1726. The result will be called the French Enlightenment, l'âge des Lumières. The first component activated by Conti for the new Newtonian party in France were his old friends, the school and followers of Malebranche, who had just died the year before. The Malebranchists were the first to accept Newton's optics, and they claimed to have duplicated Newton's experiments, something that no Frenchman had done up to that time. So Conti mobilized the Malebranche network. He also used his friendship with Fontenelle, the secretary of the French Academy of Sciences, to assure a kind of benevolent neutrality, at least, regarding Newton. Conti had other friends, including Réaumur, Fréret, Desmoulins. You can see some of these names on the map of the Paris Metro today. They were influential scientists. During the late teens and 20s in Paris, an important salon met at the Hôtel de Rohan, the residence of one of the greatest families of the French nobility. This family was aligned with Venice. The librarian at the Hôtel de Rohan was a certain Abbé Oliva, an Italian, and he presided over a Venetian-style salon, a conversazione, which was attended by Conti, his Parisian friends, and Italians. This was a circle of freethinkers, libertines, atheists, Satanists. In retrospect, the best known of the participants in this group was Charles-Louis de Secondar, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, known as Montesquieu. Before Voltaire, before Rousseau, before the Encyclopedia, the first important figure of the French Enlightenment and the leading theoretician on political institutions was Montesquieu. Conti met Montesquieu at the Hôtel de Rohan and at another salon called Le Club de l'Entresol, very important. Later, when Conti had returned to Venice, Montesquieu came there to visit him and stayed in his house for a month. Montesquieu was an agent of Conti. Montesquieu's major work is The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748. Now, this is a work of decidedly Venetian flavor. It talks about monarchies, republics, despotisms as the three forms of government. It talks about other political themes. Montesquieu took most of his ideas directly from Conti. Conti had written a profile on France called Historical and Political Discourse on the State of France between 1700 and 1730. In his treatise, Montesquieu points out that France has an independent judiciary, the so-called parliaments, which became the main focus for Anglo-Venetian destabilization going into the French Revolution. Montesquieu was the first important French writer to raise the theme of Anglophilia. He praised the allegedly constitutional monarchy of Britain as the ideal form of government. And with this, the pro-British bent of Conti's Enlightenment philosophe is established. The ground was being prepared for Newton. Now, one of Conti's other friends from the Hôtel de Rohan was a Jesuit called Tournemine, who was a high school teacher. And one of his high school teachers had been a young libertine by the name of François-Marie Arouet. And this young kid had been so stubborn and incorrigible and headstrong that the parents and teachers called him le volontaire, which means self-willed or misbehaved. And gradually, volontaire was shortened to Voltaire. And French literary historians are instinctively not friendly to the idea that the most famous Frenchman in history was a Venetian agent working for Conti. But the proof is convincing. Voltaire knew Conti personally. He knew Conti's works. Conti is referred to a number of times in Voltaire's letters. In one letter, Voltaire admiringly writes an anecdote about Conti and Newton. And in this, Conti says to Newton, "You're about to get angry with me, but I don't care." Voltaire admired this very much. "I agree with Conti," says Voltaire, "that all geometry can ever give us are about 40 useful theorems. And beyond that, it's nothing more than a fascinating subject. Just don't let metaphysics creep in." Conti also shares Voltaire shares Conti's view of the so-called Spanish conspiracy against Venice in 1618, allegedly masterminded by the Spanish ambassador to Venice, Count Bedmar. The Soviet Academy of Sciences preserved Voltaire's library in the Hermitage of St. Petersburg, and we find that Voltaire possessed Conti's collected works and one of his tragedies. Now, the book which made Voltaire famous was his philosophical letters. These are sometimes called the English letters because they're devoted to the exaltation of everything British. Voltaire had observed this during his 3 years in London. Now, in the essay on Shakespeare, Voltaire writes that Shakespeare is considered the Corneille of England, Corneille being a French playwright. Now, that is a direct quote from Conti, taken from the headnote to Conti's tragedy Giulio Cesare, which had been published in Paris in 1726. Voltaire's view of Shakespeare was that he was sometimes inspired but barbarous and crazy for not respecting French theatrical conventions. And this is exactly what Conti also thought. So we can thus associate Conti with Voltaire's first important breakthrough, the point where Anglophilia becomes Anglomania in France. Most important, Voltaire's philosophical letters center on the praise of Newton. There are chapters on Bacon, on Locke, but 4 chapters on Newton, and these are the guts of the work. For Voltaire, Newton was the first discoverer of the calculus and the dismantler of the Descartes system. Newton's sublime ideas and discoveries have given him the most universal reputation. Voltaire also translated Newton directly and published a book, The Elements of Newtonian Philosophy. Now, the philosophical letters were not popular, they were condemned, and Voltaire had to hide in the libertine underground for a while. He then began work on another book, The Century of Louis XIV. Now, the idea here was simple: exalt Louis XIV in order to attack the current king, Louis XV, by comparison. And this is an idea which is coming out of Conti's manuscripts, that profile that I mentioned before. Louis XV, of course, was one of the main targets of these Anglo-Venetians. In 1759, Voltaire published his short novel, Candide, a distillation of Venetian cultural pessimism, expressed as a raving attack on Leibniz through the vicious caricature, Dr. Pangloss. Towards the end of the story, Candide asks Pangloss, "Tell me, my dear Pangloss, when you were hanged, dissected, cruelly beaten, forced to row as a galley slave, did you still think that everything was for the best, in the best of all possible worlds?" Pangloss says, "Yes, I still hold to my original opinions. I'm a philosopher, and it wouldn't be proper for me to recant, since Leibniz cannot be wrong, and pre-established harmony is the most beautiful thing in the world, along with the plenum and subtle matter." That's the polemic. Now, when Candide visits Venice, he meets a distinguished Venetian senator, Senatore Pococurante, and he considers him the greatest genius that he has met in his travels, because everything bores him and nothing pleases him. And Senatore Pococurante is clearly a figure for Abbot Antonio Conti. He's the one who said to Newton, "Non me ne curo, Pococurante." I don't care, I'm bored. Conti later translated one of Voltaire's plays into Italian. Now, Conti's influence does not end here. His discussion of the supremacy of the sense of touch among the senses comes back in the writings of the French Enlightenment philosopher Condillac. Echoes of Conti have been found in Jacques the Fatalist by Diderot. And then there is Buffon, who published Newton's book on fluxions in French. More research is simply likely to demonstrate that the ideas of the French Enlightenment come from the Venetian Conti. The creation of a pro-Newton, anti-Leibniz party of French Anglo-maniacs was the decisive contribution to the defeat of France in the mid-century World War, which we call the 7 Years' War, which gave Britain naval supremacy and world domination. Conti's work was also the basis for the later unleashing of the French Revolution. In the epistemological war of those days, the French Newtonians were indispensable for the worldwide propagation and consolidation of the Newton myth. In Italy, of course, Conti had writers like the Venetian Algarotti, who wrote a book entitled Newtonian Philosophy for Ladies. Newton's ideas were also spread by Abbot Guido Grandi, who helped to rehabilitate Galileo inside the Catholic Church. Only with the help of Venice could the senile cultist kook, Newton, attain worldwide respect. Now, Conti was active until mid-century. He died in 1749. In Venice, he became the central figure of a salon that was the worthy heir of Ridotto Morosini. This was something that called itself the philosophical happy conversation. And there gathered patrician families like the Emo, the Nani, Querini, Memmo, Justinian. These again were libertines, freethinkers, Satanists, and so forth. After Conti's death, the dominant figure was a certain Andrea Memmo, one of the leaders of European Freemasons. One agent that was shared by Memmo with the Morosini family was a certain Giacomo Casanova, a homosexual who was backed up by a network of lesbians. And you can read all about it. Casanova is the founder of the modern Comintern. Casanova's main task was to target the French King Louis XV through his sexual appetites, or if that failed, to kill him. Louis XV finally banned Casanova from France with a decree, a lettre de cachet. Another agent for this group was a certain Count Cagliostro, a charlatan and mountebank whose targets were Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And he destabilized them through their own folly in the celebrated Queen's Necklace affair of 1785. Cagliostro was able to make Louis XVI and especially Queen Marie Antoinette personally hated, and that was a necessary precondition for mass insurrection against them. The Emperor Napoleon said in retrospect that the Queen's Necklace affair of Cagliostro had marked the opening phase of the French Revolution of 1789. Now, the last member of this Conti Memmo Conversazione was Gianmaria Ortes, who had been taught Newton by Conti personally, as well as by Grandi. Ortes was another defrocked cleric operating as an abbé. Ortes is the author of a manual of Newtonian physics for young aristocrats, including a chapter on electricity, which manages to avoid Benjamin Franklin in the same way that Galileo avoided Kepler. Ortes worked on the fundamental Conti program of applying the Newtonian method to the social sciences. This meant that everything had to be expressed in numbers. If you read Ortes, you realize that he was like the constipated mathematician who worked his problem out with a pencil. He produced a calculus on the value of opinions, a calculus on the pleasures and pains of human life, a calculus on the truth of history. And from here we get the Bentham hedonistic calculus. Ortes thought that there could be and never had been any improvement in the standard of living of the human species. Never happened and never would happen. And using these methods, Ortes posited an absolute upper limit for the human population of the earth, which he set at 3 billion. This is the first carrying capacity. Ortes therefore provided all of the ideal content that is found in of heaven. Parmenides is ideas themselves the object of philosophical attention. In his treatise on ideas, Conti writes that the fundamental error of Plato is to attribute real existence to human ideas. This is impermissible. Our ideas are nothing more than combinations of sense perceptions, according to Conti. In 1735, Conti was denounced by the Venetian Inquisition because of his reported religious ideas. Conti was accused of denying the existence of God. True to his factional pedigree, Conti also denied the immortality of the human soul. Conti reportedly said of the soul, "Since it is united with a material body and mixed up with matter, the soul perishes with the body." The dead soul's faction. Conti got off with the help of some of his patrician aristocrat friends. He commented that God is something we cannot know about, and he jokingly confessed his ignorance. He even compared himself to Cardinal Nicholas Cusanus. Conti described his own atheism as simply a version of the docta ignorantia. Senatore poco curante still lives in every classroom where Newton is taught. And surely it is time for an epistemological revolution to roll back the Venetian frauds of Galileo, of Newton, and of Bertrand Russell. Thank you.